Welcome to the first in the Allanian's events in which we interview former pupils of the schools and have question and answers with them. The first one is with Seb Payne, who now works for the Financial Times, a very well-known journalist in the country who's produced his first book, Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England. I hope you enjoy the chat with him. Seb was an incredibly good person to interview. He's absolutely full of interesting facts, plenty of gossip, and wonderful reflections on the school as well. Thank you. So welcome back to Dame Allan's to talk about your first book, Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England, which was just published this week. Seb attended Dame Allan's in the sixth form and studied computer science, economics, business and politics. You then had quite an unconventional route into journalism, studying computer science at Durham and then investigative journalism at City University in London. You've worked on the Daily Telegraph, BBC News, Sky News. You're now with the Financial Times. 2014, you were the Lawrence Stern Fellow at the Washington Post in the United States, covering the Obama presidency. 2019, you were a part of a Financial Times team that won the Press Gazette Award for your work on the Corbyn Revolution. Your book has won rave reviews, if I may embarrass you.
I'll go for that, yeah.
The Guardian said it was engrossing, warm and insightful. Andrew Neil said it was the political book of the year. And Robert Peston said it was a must-read for anyone who wants to understand England today. So Seb, if I may start, in the book you very kindly mentioned the school. You said you felt you were very fortunate to attend Dame Allan's. What are your memories of the school?
Obviously your politics classes has to be the first one. So I came to Dame Allan's in 2005, which was like a long time ago, and I'd gone to a comprehensive school in Gateshead, and I kind of hated it, if I'm going to be quite honest, not Dame Allan's, sorry. And I really wanted to study computing, which I was kind of obsessed with, and I wanted to study politics. And my mother taught at Sacred Heart just up the road here, so knew Dame Allan's very well. And so when it came to that point, we were able to get into a situation where I could apply here, did my GCSEs and came here, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I've still got a group of friends who I remain in touch with very strongly, about 12 of us. And there was something about the atmosphere of the school that was just great. Like, people were very friendly. It was different way of teaching in an entirely different way. I think it was, I'd say, maybe a high caliber. That's not too rude to say that. And I think it, compared to being in a very, very big school when you've got like 200 people in a year, coming here when you've got a much tighter focus from teachers, a much better just style of teaching. And I think, there's still things I remember in the year 12 and 13 politics classes that we used to do that still come to mind when I'm doing things in Westminster now. So I have really great memories.
That's wonderful, Seb. A fantastic answer to start the interview with, I must say. Were there any...
So you always butter them up to start with.
Right. It's going to get harder.
Yeah.
Are there any opportunities that you feel you've had in your career because you went to Dame Allan's?
I mean, everything. Like, I wouldn't have... Because... Mr. Oliver gave me the best bit of career advice I've ever had, which was when I was applying to university in year 13, I really wanted to do politics, and he said, no, don't do that. Do something that will actually get you a job at the end of it. So I applied for computer science, and I got into Manchester, Kiel, which is my backup one if I recall, and Durham. And I obviously went to Durham and loved it, and I did lots of journalism there. I didn't really do most politics things at Durham, but I did a lot of journalism. And then when I eventually applied to get a job, because I was seen as a journalistic nerd, shall we say. Those two things came together very well, and I would not have got my job at the Telegraph, and I certainly would have got a job at My Spectator if it hadn't been for computer science. So really, I'll give you full credit and say everything started from the Sixth Form Centre.
Right, that's excellent to know, Seb. Before we move on to the book, I think one of the most interesting things you've done in your career was as a correspondent for the Washington Post for a period of time. I think you reported on the White House. President Obama, if I may remember, complimented you on your trousers one day. Is that right?
That was right. No, I was dressed. I decided to go full colonial and was wearing a white linen suit. And as he came off Air Force One, he went, "Hey, that's a gay." He said, "Hey, that's a gay get up Colin and said, "That's a great get-up, bro." And I was like, "It's not a get-up, it's a suit," but he didn't like it anyway. That was great. Like, it was the Stern Fellowship is like kind of 4 months. You go to America and you just get thrown into the Washington Post. And my knowledge of US politics literally came from year 13 politics lessons. I really didn't have any idea what I was doing. But it was great, and I got to do lots of good things around Air Force One, covered Capitol Hill, did the White House. I spent 4 days watching President Obama play golf from the side of a golf course. It was very exciting and stimulating. But yeah, the Washington Post was an amazing experience, and when I came back from that, that's when I got the opportunity to join the FT.
You're obviously in the United States studying politics at a very interesting time. A lot of people say American politics is just incredibly divided at the moment. Did you get that sense when you were there?
The thing that shocked me the most was the racial element to it, because we obviously have some issues in terms of race in this country, but in America it's a whole other level. And when you get there, it's an undercurrent to absolutely everything. You know, even when you're on Capitol Hill, you have caucuses based on different ethnicities, and you just don't get that in the UK. And I think as the UK is becoming more diverse, that may become more of a thing. But I was very shocked by it, and when there's also, of course, there's a lot of guns as well. Like, the Washington Post thought it would be funny to send me to the most right-wing things they could, just to alarm me. They sent me to this thing called the Defending the American Dream Summit in Texas. And when you arrived, they actually offered you a gun to take in with you, and were like, you know, just in case you need protection. And I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm just here as a journalist. And they were like, "Where are you from?" The Washington Post, like, "Oh, you definitely need a gun." So I didn't take up that offer.
Guns in the United States is probably one of the questions that politics people ask most. Did you ever get to the heart of why Americans cling to their guns so much?
Not really, and I still don't understand it. I think you can go Second Amendment, right to bear arms. I think Americans have a very different view of the state and what it does. So for us, we don't really care about government. We don't really care about taxes that much. It's kind of quite relaxed. In America, it's all about the individual and fighting off any oppressors. And I guess this goes back to the War of Independence, the fact that you've got a very individual state system as opposed to a big central federal government. So it's kind of that, but it's also just completely nuts as well. That, like, everywhere you go, there are so many guns. And when you go into the South, you know, I went to North Carolina, I went to Florida, I went to Texas. It's totally ubiquitous that people will just wander around with like massive handguns and will have shotguns in their cars with them as well. It's like, for what purpose? What do you think this is going to do? Like, oh, you never know. Well, you do know. You're going to shoot someone and kill them. Like, it's just a total cultural thing I still don't really understand.
So moving on to your book, it was just published this week, so I think very few people in the audience will have read it. I've just about got halfway through it, which is, of course, a gripping read. I'm going very slowly to enjoy it. But for the benefit of the audience, could you give us a brief summary of what the book is all about, please?
So basically, political journalists like me get a lot of things wrong. And I got the 2017 election wrong. I got the Brexit referendum wrong. And I started to think, that when I came back from America, maybe I need to think a bit differently about how you report on the country, because when you're in London and in Westminster, it's like a bubble. Everyone thinks the same things. There's like a window of acceptable views on stuff, which, you know, sort of at the moment is Boris Johnson is evil, Keir Starmer's useless, and, you know, you can debate whether those things are true or not. And so in 2015, I started going around the country and I bought this really clapped out Ode Mini from like a very Ode style one. And it broke down 19 times during that election campaign, including once with Nigel Farage in the car, and he was very, very angry with me. And so I did that, and that was when I started to see this thing called UKIP. In 2017, I did it again. And that was when I started to get the sense that actually maybe Theresa May wasn't all that good and that she wasn't going to win. Then in 2019, did it for a third time. And that was when I went around to all these places that voted Tory for the first time in living memory. And it's called the Red Wall. And that's because, A, they're contiguous. That means it's a band, so it looks like a wall. They're also very pro-Brexit, and they've just never had Tory MPs. And the question was it just about Brexit, Boris Johnson's Get Brexit Done slogan, or was it about more than that? So I went back, and over the last year, I've spent about a week in each of these places in total. I've interviewed over 200 people. I did 6,000 miles, and it was completely exhausting, to try and get to the bottom of, have we seen a structural change in how England votes, or was it just a one-off? Now, it's not just a one-off, because otherwise I wouldn't have written a 450-page book on it, but I think fundamentally we have seen a big shift. So from Blythe Valley, Northumberland, down to Yorkshire, to Lancashire, to the West Midlands, Lincolnshire, West Midlands, then back up to Lancashire again. I went to 10 places to try and draw a picture of, is this a big change? And the answer I've come to is yes.
Correct. In the book, you interview a very wide range of people, some very prominent: Tony Blair, Neil Kinnock, Boris Johnson, the MPs who won their seats, lots of local people. Which person did you most enjoy interviewing, and why?
Oh, that's a good question. There's some complete Fruit Loops I interviewed who got cut from the book, which my editor just said, we can't have them, they're too crazy. And I always like the crazies because they give colour and texture. I mean, look, Boris Johnson is obviously a kind of amazing person to be with, and I spent the day with him in Hartlepool, and we were on the seafront there, which, I don't know if any of you know, it's sort of a little bit down a hill, shall we say. There were all these people milling around getting fish and chips on a Thursday morning, and suddenly he arrives, and people abandoned their cars to run to the seafront and caused a massive traffic jam. And in the book, I described it as being at the Pied Piper in the middle of a hurricane. And I thought that was just the most amazing thing to see that, Hartlepool, this place that's never had a Tory MP, a place that was decimated by Margaret Thatcher. And yet here's a Tory Prime Minister. People are literally abandoning their cars to run and see. That was kind of an amazing moment. Although his interview transcript, when one of my researchers who worked on the book said that is the most incoherent thing I've ever read in my life. It was like going through it, and I was like, how am I going to construct some sense out of what he's just said? So that was obviously great. I really enjoyed Alan Milburn, actually. So Alan Milburn is from the Northeast. He was a trade unionist in the 70s and 80s, then became the MP for Darlington in 92. And he was a big figure under Tony Blair. He sort of disappeared a bit now. He left Parliament in 2010. But when I sat down with him, he lives in Northumberland, I think it's Stocksfield he lives in. He was great, and I was just like, what happened to this figure? How come he was never contention for Prime Minister? But everything he said about the fact, because he talked about the Sunderland shipyards, which he tried to save, and his view was, we spent far too much time trying to save the shipyards when they could never be saved. What we should have focused on was what was going to replace them, and they didn't, and that led to decades of unemployment and lots of things you know about in Sunderland. So he was great. I love Neil Kinnock as well. So Neil Kinnock, Lord Neil Kinnock's now 80. He's maybe not in the best of health, but we spent an hour together. I've never heard a man use the word bloody so many times. It was literally every other stand. The bloody miners, the bloody Arthur Scargill, the bloody Tories, bloody Margaret Thatcher. Just went on the whole time. But he was so cogent and on it and coherent. And I just kind of felt honoured, like this great figure of history. And I guess Michael Heseltine and Norman Tebbett as well are in that category because they're both in their 90s now, the last remnants of the Thatcher era. So I enjoyed all those people.
Could I pick you up, Seb, on Norman Tebbett? Because the interview with Norman Tebbett, who was Employment Secretary under Margaret Thatcher, seems to be the one that really stands out for how frank he was. He said that he felt that when the heavy industry closed under Margaret Thatcher, shipyards, constant steel works, coal mines, that they didn't fully appreciate what the effect would be on society, and they didn't fully support the Northeast by getting people into more work. Were you surprised by Norman Tebbett's comments, and did you agree with them?
Yes and yes, because obviously in the 1980s, Norman Tebbett very famously said, when my father was out of his work, he got on his bike to get a job, and that was seen as a real affront to these communities. So if you take Concert, the steelworks there employed 3,900 people when they closed, but the whole town was based on the steelworks, from the pubs to the working men's clubs, the chippies, everything was connected in to that thing. So and the employment in Concert rose to 36%. So you can imagine a town, more than a third of the people don't have any kind of work at all. And Lord Tebbett's comments were very interesting, because what he's not saying is we shouldn't have done this, which is a very crucial thing, because that's been Labour's narrative for the decades, is that we should have kept the steelworks going, kept the mines going. He's saying we should have done it, but we should have done more support. And if you look at Essex and Kent, where the Tories did very well under Margaret Thatcher, they were connected to London and they had much more that could have replaced it. And I thought it was a very frank acknowledgement from a man who's obviously well into his retirement now and reflecting on that as well. But as I kind of argue in the book, these places have come through that process. So the 80s and 90s were really difficult. But if you go to a lot of these places that I went to, they're actually now kind of prosperous and rich. So I went to in another place in concert, Lanchester Wines, and the car park was full of Beamers and Audis. And I thought, hang on a minute, the miners didn't have Beamers and Audis, they didn't have 5-bedroom Barratt homes, they weren't going on a holiday. And that's Labour's problem. These places are not, they're not Billy Elliot meets Coronation Street, they're actually just like a lot of the rest of the country.
Leading on to that, Boris, given sorry, Seb.
We're not that similar.
Pardon me, my apologies. It's very surprising in the book that you go to places where people say, you know, my father voted Labour, my grandfather voted Labour. They turn in their graves and they voted for Boris. When you interview Boris about it, you say he kind of ruffles his hair and moves on and doesn't really explain why he thinks he's so popular. Did you ever get to the bottom of why people generally like Boris in the North East?
The one thing I've met from my interactions with Boris Johnson is he hates talking about himself. Anything to do with him, his slightly colourful personal life, he just goes totally shuts up. And it was so funny because he did his thing with his hair and he was just about to say something and then pulled himself back. I was like, come on, what were you going to say? And then he just moves on very quickly. First of all, Boris is optimistic, and a lot of people in Westminster are like, they hate it. They hate this thing that he's always being upbeat, you know, the world-beating vaccine programme, the world-beating test and trace, which obviously, you know, was a complete disaster. But that kind of boosterism, as people call it, people love it. People like where they live. This isn't even a surprising concept. But if you live, you know, in a relatively decent off situation in Northumberland and Blythe Valley, when a guy comes along and says, you should be proud of where you live, but I'm going to make it even better, it's not a surprise. Whereas the last election, Jeremy Corbyn said, you know, we're a society of the billionaires and the homeless, and painted this very dark, negative picture. And yeah, we do have billionaires and we do have too many homeless, but that's not most people's lives. And Boris somehow connected into that, combined with the fact that he's a sort of celebrity and he's been in the public eye for, 25 years now? So people feel like they know him because of his persona. And he's just very recognisable. And, you know, as one of the things I said in the book, Boris Johnson can walk down any street in the country and people will know who he is. Barely anybody knows who Keir Starmer is. When I was in Doncaster, I decided just to ask everybody, you know, here's a picture, do you know who this is? 2 people out of about 30 knew who he was. One said, isn't he that Remain bloke? Which is probably not the vibe he wants to get across. And the second of all was, he's that guy who hates white people. And this was a reference to when he took the knee representing the Black Lives Matter movement. And this got shared very widely on social media. And I tried to explain to the blog that was not what Black Lives Matter is about. But he was completely insistent that Keir Starmer hates all white people and he was never going to vote for him. So you compare that to how the fact everybody knows who Boris is. And I think explains a lot of what happened.
Thanks, Seb. At this point, can I open it up to the audience for any questions? Mr. Scott?
Okay. Thank you. Hi, Seb. Thank you so much for coming today. I read you're a big fan of directly elected mayors, and presumably we should have one for Newcastle. And who should it be?
Good question. Well, so basically there's this classic northeast that they've got a north of Tyne mayor because Gateshead was arguing with Newcastle, Durham was arguing with Newcastle. So you've got this ludicrous situation where you've got an obvious conurbation of the northeast, which would be probably about 1.5, 2 million people or so. And it's split by the River Tyne, which is ludicrous. There's so many good people. Like I mentioned Alan Milburn, he'd be a brilliant mayor for the northeast. Obviously, Tony Blair, I think, would be a very interesting character who's still eyeing up some kind of a turn to frontline politics. But I really do think we do need a lot more mayors. If you look at Ben Houchen down in Tees Valley, Andy Burnham over in Manchester, Andy Street in the West Midlands, really successful politicians who are actually rivaling Westminster for having a good public platform. So I just hope Newcastle Gateshead can get over their stupid rivalry and realise it would be much better to have a northeast mayor. Or Tyneside mayor, I think, to be technically accurate.
Great. Should we take a few more questions? Yeah.
Whilst you report on lots of different people and parties across the political spectrum, a lot of your work tends to focus on the Conservative Party. How does that change your political views? Does that make you more conservative, less conservative?
So I try to in my day job at the FT, I do a lot of writing about the Conservative Party. We have one of my colleagues focuses on the Labour Party, so I do bits of Labour. Within the book, it should be roughly balanced. It should not be one way or the other. That we've got Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Tony Blair, Ed Miliband, David Miliband, Alan Milburn, plus all Labour MPs as well. So hopefully it should be balanced. I think I remember one interview was when I interviewed Caroline Flint, who was a minister under Tony Blair and was the MP for Don Valley. We went and spent an afternoon in the pub, and it was a bit like a therapy session. It went on for 4.5 hours, and she brought along every canvass return from every election as she was pouring out her heart. And when I left, I felt this is really bad. She was a great MP, she loved her area, and we've definitely lost something. And when I met the Tory guy who replaced her, who was, I think the term is low wattage, I was kind of like, and I was like, just strip aside party politics. She should obviously be the MP for this area. But then I've also seen the flip side as well, when I've met some Labour MPs, some of the ones in the Northwest, who were just completely useless. They're saying, well, it's obvious why you lost, you were just rubbish. So I think I've actually, having done this, just taking a bit less of an apolitical view and looking at it just across the board at, like, there's some really good people on both sides. And to take Keir Starmer, he's struggling, I think it's fair to say, as Labour leader. I think he's a really decent guy. He's a really nice guy. He texted me on Friday and said, can I have a free copy of your book? And I thought, can you not afford to go to a bookshop and buy one? But I felt that was not the right thing to say. So I ended up going down he lives quite nearby me, and I ended up having a chat with him in his front garden. And I came away from thinking that, he's just like the wrong person at this time. He's obviously a very honourable, nice guy, but combine him with just this wave of Boris Johnson, his personality, I don't see how we can compete with that. So there's a roundabout way of saying I like people on both sides.
Thanks, Seb. You'll be pleased to know Dame Allan has paid full price for
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes.
I'm wondering, when you travelled around the Red Wall areas, did you detect that people was any regrets about the course that Brexit's taken? How did people feel about that?
So it's obviously a weird thing because it's been, what are we now? We've 9 months since we actually left the EU. The Remain case that there's never been a single big thing where you could go, right, that is the fault of Brexit. So let's say Nissan in Sunderland had closed down. That would have totally transformed the whole EU debate, because that would have been a real example of leaving the EU. We've never had that. It's little bits and things around the periphery, and that makes it really tough for Remain campaigners. And COVID is actually, in this sense, a blessing for Boris Johnson, because the economic effects of coronavirus just dwarf anything to do with Brexit. And I guarantee for the rest of my life, we will be arguing about the effect Brexit has happened. Some people regret it, and I think if we had a second referendum, there would have been a lot of flows. So I think a lot of people who voted Brexit would have voted Remain. But fundamentally, most people just don't think about politics that much. So, it's hard for me when I spend my whole life obsessing about this. Most people do not care at all about politics, and they do not care about Brexit, so they just want to move on. And that was the genius of the Get Brexit Done slogan. It appealed to Remainers who just want us to forget about it, as well as Brexiters.
Thanks, Seb. Any more questions? Mr. Lynch?
What are your views on nationalism? Do you think this is adversely affecting the Labour Party, who were traditionally a nationalist movement?
Well, I think obviously a lot of people describe Boris Johnson as nationalist, and obviously his government, they love their flags behind every single TV appearance, and it isn't long before we'll have a Prime Minister wearing a Union Jack suit on TV, because that seems the natural trajectory. The problem is, Tony Blair used to say Labour has to do 2 things to win election just to be heard. 1 is to be trusted on national security, and 2 is to look as if you like the country you want to govern. And Labour hasn't fitted any of those things, I think, over the past decade. Boris Johnson obviously uses that as a wedge issue to be like, I just absolutely love this country and I could not be proud of this country, and trying to embarrass Labour. There's obviously a line between patriotism and nationalism. Does it go the other side of that? Yeah, for sure it does. But because of where Labour is, they can always outgun them on that thing without getting into the more problematic things of nationalism, which is exceptionalism and racism. And obviously, again, you can have a big debate about Boris Johnson's comments and whether they were opportunistic or whether they were overtly racist in some respects of that. But The problem with him is he's been in our public eye for so long, most people have made up their mind. Either you like him or you don't. And it's very hard to change people's minds. And that's why I think the next election will probably be okay for the Tories, but after that, he almost certainly won't be Prime Minister, because I think people will be fed up of him by then if they're not already. And people will want a different kind of view in politics, I think.
Any more questions? Minishay?
You mentioned the next election and this idea that people aren't interested in the detail, they're just interested in optimism. What do you think the Labour Party could do to sway things the other way?
So I think the narrative they have to put forward, or the story, shall we say, is Boris Johnson promised you X, Y, and Z. He promised he was going to, build you new hospitals and roads and railways and fundamentally change your lives. He hasn't done that. He's broken your promise, because the thing that happened in 2019, and I talk a lot about this in the book, is those first-time Tory voters are not suddenly Tories. There was a great Dead Ringers thing where they parodied Billy Elliot and said, I'm off doing the club, we look after me Partridge, son. And I think that shows that the fact is, these people don't instinctively trust Boris. He has to earn their trust. And if Labour can say to them, that was wrong, he failed you, then I think that gives an opening. I think Keir Starmer's done most of the right things so far, actually. He's got rid of a lot of the kind of internal disputes. We're about to have a whole load of that at the Labour Party conference next week in Brighton. I think he does that, but he has to create an alternative vision. And the problem for the left is that Boris Johnson has moved so far from where the Conservatives were. He's just raised taxes by £11 billion a year, which would make Margaret Thatcher turn in her grave. Yet he gets away with it because he's straddling the left and the right. So I think it's really tough. It's really tough for Labour. And I think the project to rebuild itself is probably going to take longer than however long, 3 years to the next election.
Any question maybe from some of the pupils?
I think it's all right.
Another one, yeah?
Are there any prominent political figures that are rated quite high at project that, in your opinion, you don't think are good?
Well, it depends who the public like, isn't it? Who aren't any good? I'm trying to think, so I don't want to be too rude here, but that's a really good question. I can tell you the reverse, which is actually, and I'll come back to that one because I need to think of someone from there. There's a lot of people who don't get rated by the general public who are actually just very good at getting on with their jobs. So one example of this actually is quite divisive is Michael Gove. So he's been in government for the past 10 years, and every department he's been in, he's been quite phenomenal actually. In education, in environment, in justice, at the Cabinet Office, and now going into levelling up. He's transformed it, and he's really wielded power in a way no one else has. Now, you can have a debate about whether he did the right thing about academies or about the environment, but he's really good. Lots of people hate him and think that he is, he's very smarmy, that, he's got a very sort of bizarre, turning up in a nightclub in Aberdeen a couple of nights ago, very odd. But, I think he's someone who generally is very good. On the reverse, I think I'm going to go for David Cameron, and the reason for that is I actually think in retrospect he was a disastrous Prime Minister for the UK, that nearly everything that happened with Brexit could be traced down to things he did badly wrong in the country. So cutting local council budgets, for example, which was slashed hugely in his time, that meant that social care has been weakened, and we all know how bad that's been for elderly people with illnesses. It meant that we were not prepared for the coronavirus pandemic at all because local councils have been running on a threadbare basis. He took a gamble with the EU referendum when it wasn't prepared for Brexit or what have you. He took a big gamble in Scotland, which is still having repercussions today. So I think history will be very unkind, and that's before we get into all the reporting we've done at the FT, him working for this bank called Greensill, when he took millions of pounds to lobby the government on behalf. So those who still like David Cameron, I would say that they were wrong.
Thanks, Seb. Any more questions before we finish up yet?
Do you think we're stuck with gold
For the long term.
This was one of the scoops in your book, wasn't it, Seb?
2024, yeah.
That Boris said that he'd like to stay on for 10 more years. So Jonathan, I think, is alluding to that. What do you think about that?
Well, obviously, he might want to stay on for 10 years. The general public might have their own view on whether they think that's the right thing or not. I think the next election in 24, if we take that, that he's probably quite well placed to win that, because Labour's still in a bit of a mess. I think that argument that he set out in the book, that we need 10 years to complete the programme, and in private he talks about the Johnson decade. And the way that he sees it is he wants to be the first defining Prime Minister of the 21st century, because Blair was really a 20th century Prime Minister. David Cameron, I think he would probably share a lot of what I've just said about his views on that. Theresa May, well, maybe the less said about her, the better. But I think really that's how he sees it in those historical terms. Now, that's a very high, lofty thing. And Boris Johnson's great at campaigning and rhetoric. He's very bad at delivering. And I think fundamentally, he's not doing that well as Prime Minister. It's very chaotic in Downing Street at the moment. And I think that's the question of, can he do that? I think the next election after that, in 2029, that's really tough for Boris Johnson. At that point, the Tories have been in power for 20 years, longer than they were after Margaret Thatcher won. You'd have to think the country will get fed up with Tories by that point, and that Labour might have itself together. And I think if, say, Boris Johnson was facing Andy Burnham or Wes Streeting, there's a lot of really interesting people coming up through Labour. Lisa Nandy, the MP for Wigan, who I think is very good, and she's in the book. Then, yeah, I think that could be the case. And at that point, Boris Johnson will be in his mid-60s. He can go off and write books about is all Shakespeare he's cracked up to be, which I believe was due to file a couple of years ago. But he will always be in the public domain. I think he's such a boisterous figure. We'll never hear the last of him.
Thanks, Seb. Any more questions? Yes, a couple more, and then I think we'll finish. Yeah.
As of course, Britain is now a very developed nation, and the problems which we were facing just a few years ago are very, very different from what they are now. And of course, well, as it's been now, a lot of the things that Labour would usually promise have now been done by the Tories. So would you say that it's time for Labour to drastically change the typically socialist image it would portray itself by, particularly under Corbyn, for example?
Well, to answer that in a slightly different way, the question is, can Labour ever win an election again in this country? Because Scotland has gone for Labour, and they've got no real sign to win it back. They're on to their 7th leader of Scottish Labour since 2014. If you think that's never going to come back, the only way Labour would have to oust Jacob Rees-Mogg to win a majority government without Scotland, which is very unlikely to happen. They love him down in Somerset. So I think the question for Labour is, do they have to look at an electoral pact? And I think that's going to become a big thing, because if the Greens, the Lib Dems and Labour did a proper pact, then they could oust the Tories very, very easily. Now, the public tend to not like tactical voting that much. It's actually in Labour's constitution to not do electoral pacts. So they would have to change that. But I think they lose the next election, that will become a real issue. And in that case, you basically have the Lib Dems try and appeal in seats where the Tories win. Labour has to focus on the North and the Midlands. And then the Green Party, I don't know, Brighton or whatever, the Green Party do quite well. So that's the kind of thing you could see happening. Interestingly, after the Hartlepool by-election, some of my friends from DC got in touch and said to me, if it wasn't for Joe Biden, the Democrats would be seeing exactly what you've just had in Hartlepool, because the Democrats have got this push and pull between the big cities, New York, DC, where they do very well, and then their Rust Belt, their equivalent of the Red Wall in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, where they're all loving Donald Trump there, and it hadn't been for coronavirus, we would have voted for Donald Trump again. But the sheer force of Joe Biden's personality, that he can straddle the big cities, but also him himself is very authentically of the Rust Belt. What happens after Joe Biden? You know, if Kamala Harris runs next time, I don't see how she's going to appeal to that particular kind of demographic. So if you look at left-wing parties all across the world, they're all struggling with this question. In Germany too, we've got the German elections coming up, and the SPD, which are the sort of German left-wing equivalent of Labour, they're only winning thanks to a coalition with the Green Party and the German Liberals, which are like the Lib Dems. So that is a big question in the future. If left-wing parties want to win, do they have to work with others?
Thanks, Seb. I think maybe just one more question. As you know, as an Allanian, the most important part of the day is lunchtime. So I really can't go on too much into lunch. But was there one more question from a pupil? Nassif, yeah.
My question is if Labour were to hypothetically win an election in the future, how do you think that would affect foreign policy in relations with allies? Would it go to a more socialist stance, or would it come to a similar policy with the Conservatives?
Really good question. I think on Brexit and the EU, it's the most difficult because Keir Starmer wants to, as he calls it, repair some of the problems, because the trade deal Boris Johnson has done as part of Brexit is very limited. It doesn't do that much for trade. It's got a lot of disruption, as you've seen by supermarket shelves and the situation in Northern Ireland. So that would change. We would get closer to Europe in that sense, and we would have to be locked into more of the rules in Europe. If Keir Starmer's Labour leader, I think things like NATO, the special relationship with America, that would stay the same. I don't think that would change. If it was someone like Jeremy Corbyn, it would be a complete break. And I think you'll be looking at things like, do we continue Trident on nuclear deterrent? Do we remain in NATO? So that could go in a socialist direction. But, as I think I probably argue in the book, I don't think someone with that platform can win an election. So fundamentally, it would kind of be roughly the same where it is now. But I do think the European dimension would change quite a lot. And of course, the Tories would say, and I think Boris says in the book, we'll be back in half the EU before you know it, and then you can just rerun the Brexit referendum over and over again. So, yeah.
Thanks, Seb. Could I just finish off with one question? What advice would you give to pupils who are interested in following in your footsteps into journalism?
Don't know. Look, journalism is just the most fun things. I remember when I was here, and I think I had a teenage job at Greg's the Baker, actually, and I almost got sacked for shortchanging someone by 20p. I used to wear a hairnet serving pasties from that one that's open 24 hours in Newcastle. And like, that for me was work. I have never felt that every day, any day is work for me. It's always a pleasure. I just love talking to people and their stories. That's why I do this. It can be frustrating, it can be exhausting, but it's great. This is really trite advice, but we're sitting in a library. Everything I've sort of kind of done and have learned is just reading. And anyone can do that. Anyone can pick up a book and just start to develop your own thoughts on stuff as well. Read fiction. That's my best advice. Don't read political books. Political books actually are very dry and are not good. Read really good novels, and I think that's the thing for being good writing and understanding people better. And I think go back to your advice as well. Don't just think about politics or journalism. Think about something else. And I think about this like as the band U2, because individually they're all rubbish musicians, but they have this USP that for some reason people really like them. So find your USP and find something that's a bit different to other people. That's what we want.
Thanks, Seb. I think Bono might not be that happy about your comments, but we've been absolutely delighted.
I can live with that, I think.
So thanks very much, Seb. Delighted that you've come back from Dame Allan. It's a fascinating talk, and I hope the book sells really well.
So do I. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time to listen to it. Thank you.
There you go.
Oh.